The world's ancient myths have a tremendous amount to say about the subject of money. This is a painting by Rembrandt of Jesus chasing the money changers from the temple, or it's sometimes called the cleansing of the temple, chasing out the moneylenders. And it is based on texts that are found in Matthew, Mark, and John. Here's the text from Matthew. And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and said unto them, It is written, My house shall be the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. Matthew 21:12-13. Ye is the plural form of you, so it's equivalent to y'all. He's saying, y'all have made it into a den of thieves. You collective money lenders, money changers. Here's another painting showing the cleansing of the temple. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple. That's the passage from John chapter 2. So the scourge is like a whip. See the small scourge he's made, or small cords. He's raising in his hand a scourge, a whip of small cords to drive them all out of the temple. Now notice in this painting, the ones who are selling doves in some artwork are associated with women. It's women who are the sellers of the doves in some of this Renaissance era artwork. Here's another one. It's a little bit later, from the 1800s. But once again, we see that it's women who are holding the doves. And I'll just include the passage from Mark to round it out. And they come to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. So the Mark passage is very similar to the Matthew passage, but there is one detail included in the Mark passage that is not included in the other passages. Just like the scourge of small cords, that's found in the John passage. In this Mark passage, we get an additional detail that Jesus, it said, he went into the temple, he cast them out, and he would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. The reason I'm pointing out the woman with the doves in the artwork and nobody's allowed to carry a vessel through the temple, this is celestial. It's a celestial scene. I'm going to quickly show you that this is a celestial scene. A man carrying a vessel is a celestial clue. He's not going to let anyone carrying. So we're talking about a specific part of the sky. Who could a man carrying a vessel through the temple be? Well, that would be the constellation Aquarius. I'm going to show you the zodiac constellation of Aquarius in the night sky. It's outline Aquarius. It's a man kind of in a deep running, or even he's running so fast that he's stumbling forward posture, holding a vessel, in a large vessel out of which is flowing two streams of water, or it could be two streams of wine when we turn water to wine. But do you see anyone in this painting that is in the posture of Aquarius with he's falling forward. He's got a forward leg and an extended, very extended rear leg, but he's holding a vessel out of which something is spilling out. Right here, look at the parallels to the outline of Aquarius. This is no accident. Down through the centuries, going all the way back to the ancient times, sacred subjects are depicted with conventions that match up with the outlines of the constellations if you know how to outline them. The way that we're shown on Wikipedia is there to confuse you and not help you to see the actual outlines. For whatever reason, H.A. Rey in 1952 published this book with the outlines that are the clues to seeing the connections between the myths and the stars. To my knowledge, he never publicized that connection, never argued that connection, but his outline of Aquarius, when you see it, then you can see it in the artwork that is referring to Aquarius, but the passage itself says he doesn't let anyone carry a vessel through the temple. We're talking about a celestial scene. Now Jesus, he takes up a small scourge of cords. He makes a little whip out of small cords. So that's a different constellation. This scene is based on this part of the sky. Jesus is not always associated with the constellation I'm going to show you, but in this scene, with his little scourge of small cords, he is associated with the constellation Perseus. Perseus, I'm going to outline the constellation for you. Now, look at the constellation in the heavens. Look at the artist's depiction of Jesus with the scourge of small cords. That scourge of small cords, that little curl, that's the actual outline in the heavens. Perseus, in the myths, the hero Perseus uses a small hooked sword for the very same reason. His sword is called a harpe sword, and it has a hook on it because of the constellation in the sky. Well, in other myths, in other stories, in the ancient wisdom given to all the different cultures, that little hook could be envisioned as a scourge, a little whip made out of small cords. And look at the outline of Jesus with the outstretched arm. He's got the scourge of small cords. He's got one foot more extended than the other from his long cloak there. He is clearly in the position of Perseus, the scourge of small cords being in the position of the little hook on one side of Perseus, and then his outstretched arm pointing, he's throwing out the moneylenders, he's overturning the tables, he's driving out those who are selling doves. Why is it always a woman who's selling doves? Well, that outstretched arm is pointing to, he's overturning the seat of those who sell doves. He's upending them. The constellation Andromeda, which is a beautiful woman, plays a lot of different figures in different myths, but the constellation Andromeda looks like she's had her seat upended. She's been tossed over, spilled over by Perseus, who's pointing towards her. And can you see how Andromeda, the outline in the Greek myths, she is chained to a rock. She actually has chains coming off of one hand, one upper hand right there. That is the wings of the dove being held by the women who are selling the doves, or the sellers of doves. The text itself doesn't say it's women, but down through the centuries, it's portrayed as women. Why? This is a celestial scene. She's got like a little dove cage on her head, and there's like a cloth, a white cloth, a rectangular cloth covering one side of the little dove coat that she's got there in the little dove cage. That square, that rectangle, is right next to the head of Andromeda in the sky. That is known as the Great Square. Back in 2016, in my book, Star Myths of the Bible, when I talked about this scene, I argued that that's the table. You know, it says in the text, he's overturning the tables and the seats of those who are selling oxen and sheep and doves in the temple. Well, we just happen to have oxen and sheep right nearby in this scene as well. We have someone carrying a vessel. We have someone with a scourge of small cords. We have someone having her seat upturned and the doves in one hand there. She's the seller of doves. We've got tables being turned over, and we have sheep and oxen. That would be, of course, the constellations of the zodiac. Aries, the lamb or the ram, and Taurus, the bull. Those are zodiac constellations. They're right next to Perseus and Andromeda in this scene, and the Great Square and Aquarius. This is clearly a celestial scene, but it is teaching us something very profound and important. This is an extremely important teaching that runs all the way through the Bible. Professor Michael Hudson, an economist, a modern-day economist, is also an expert on the economy of the ancient world. He has written books and studies and scholarly papers about the role of debt in the ancient world. And in his recent book entitled "And Forgive Them Their Debts: Lending, Foreclosure, and Redemption from Bronze Age Finance to the Jubilee Year," he includes on the cover a picture of the cleansing of the temple. And he says the reason why Jesus is driving out the moneylenders from the temple is because in the Bible, throughout those scriptures, it is prohibited to charge interest. It is prohibited to be a moneylender who's charging usury. And he argues that Jesus is driving the moneylenders out because that is forbidden. Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? He that walketh uprightly and worketh righteousness and speaketh the truth in his heart, backbiteth not with his tongue, nor doeth evil to his neighbor, nor taketh up a reproach against his neighbor. And then it goes on in the final verse to say, he that putteth not out his money to usury, nor taketh reward against the innocent. He that doeth these things shall never be moved. You are not supposed to put your money out at interest. And if you read this masterful book by Michael Hudson, he goes into great depth in explaining that there is no distinction in any of the ancient writings between usury and interest. Putting your money out at interest is usury, and it is condemned in the ancient wisdom of the world. Now, Michael Hudson does explain that business loans between businesses are different. Business loans from one business to another, that's different. But this is talking about devouring the poor by loaning money at interest and then foreclosing their land, which takes away their ability to keep themselves alive and impoverishes them and devours them. That was so strongly condemned that he says the whole Bible, and he's talking about the Old Testament, or he calls it the Jewish Bible, emphasizes the struggle between debtors and creditors as one of its central themes. This whole struggle between debtors and creditors is the central theme, or one of the central themes. A few good kings walking in righteousness, who protect the people from the creditors, are juxtaposed to many bad kings taxing the land and letting creditors prey on the weak and poor. Later on that same page, this is from page 181 in this book, And Forgive Them Their Debts, he says, the laws, including the Jubilee, that is a forgiveness of debts, these laws made Yahweh a protector of the poor and needy, insisting on periodic debt cancellation, liberation of debt servants, and a return of land to its former holders as a sacred covenant rather than a royal policy of individual rulers. It's not, oh, well, we should just hope for a good ruler, one that'll cancel the debts. No, it's really nice when we get a king in who cancels the debts. No, it is a sacred covenant. It's a law even above the kings that debts have to be canceled on a periodic basis. Land that's been foreclosed by creditors has to be returned to the original owners. And those who have fallen into debt servitude have to be set free. Well, you can imagine that the creditors who have gobbled up other lands were not particularly happy about this. That's why the kings are supposed to stop oligarchy from arising and enforce the return of the land and the cancellation of the debts. But there's a constant tension. That is a central narrative running through the stories of the Old Testament. He goes on to say that charging usury and this kind of use of debt and credit to enslave others and take their land and take their possessions was equivalent to stealing. It was seen as being related to the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Out of the 10 commandments, he even explains other commandments, including not taking the Lord's name in vain, are related to this concept because creditors would sometimes say, oh, you have to swear to God that you won't let this debt be canceled. And Michael Hudson argues, well, that 3rd commandment against taking the Lord's name, you can't use it in debt contracts to try and get around this jubilee, debt forgiveness, periodic, sacred debt forgiveness. But he says, usury and this kind of predatory lending was related to stealing. It is seen as being the same as stealing. And he says, to foreclose on land and not ultimately return it to the defaulting debtor was held to constitute theft. Theft. Now, I hear some of you thinking, or maybe even saying out loud, but wait a minute, why would anybody lend then? How could anyone afford to lend if, after a while, the defaulting debtor just gets the land back anyway? Well, we'll get to that. It has to do with who is supposed to be providing credit is the state that can afford to have debts canceled. It's the private lending, this private usury, these money changers who've set themselves up in the temple, in the foyer of the temple, or out in the front yard of the temple, instead of the proper function of lending, which includes debt cancellation to the needy when they're up against the wall. The private lenders, the private money changers, the private money lenders, they're the ones who put the poor into debt and then gobble up their land and don't give it back. And that's why Jesus says, you've made it into a den of thieves. That kind of lending is thievery, is stealing, is robbery. It's wrong. It's hateful. Okay? This is all celestial metaphor in the storylines. It is illustrating profound truths. Now, Michael Hudson in page 11 of this same book also explains that when the Bible is talking about sodomy, it's actually a metaphor for usury. He says, in today's interpretation of the Sodom story, the narrow focus on sexual license and other non-economic behavior misses the symbolic association of sodomy with the unrighteous behavior of greed. From Roman Stoic history down through the medieval prosecution of the Knights Templar, it was customary to depict major moneylenders as sodomites, as the ultimate expression of predatory behavior was usury. So, usury is metaphorically equated to sodomy, and the Bible is actually speaking against that. But you don't hear modern Christians saying, oh yeah, you shouldn't be loaning money at interest. They're more focused on the narrow literal interpretation rather than this predatory behavior was metaphorically compared with sodomy. He says, the word seems outdated today, but of all the vices condemned by the biblical prophets, it was the sin against which they warned above all. And then he says, see part 4. He's going to talk about it more. The biblical prophets, their number one sin that they were preaching against was usury, private lending in order to devour the wealth of others and figuratively to sodomize them. This was the number one sin out of all the vices condemned by the prophets. Is that what you hear the biblical literalists talking about today? Those who take the Bible literally? The modern religions that are supposedly built on these scriptures, you don't hear them talking about the number one sin is charging interest and lending. No, they're all for it. They're all for it. They've hijacked these ancient scriptures and turned them on their heads. The number one sin, the number one vice, Michael Hudson argues, and then he gives examples from the prophets, is money lending in order to be a predator. And he says, look, here's later on, he points to a passage from Ezekiel, one of the prophets, who is speaking for the Almighty. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. See if you hear the sin of sodomy here, of sexual sodomy listed. No, so far we've heard arrogance, overfed, unconcerned with others. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before thee. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. Why? Because of not caring about the poor, devouring the poor. Metaphorically, sodomy. It was arrogance. They're overfed and unconcerned. This is what the ancient wisdom is teaching against. Professor Hudson explains that it was a hijacking of the ancient system. In Sumer and Babylon, they forgave the debts. Some of the most extensive texts we have from Babylon was Hammurabi and Hammurabi's Code and Hammurabi's proclamations, and they're primarily proclamations of debt forgiveness and debt cancellation. Hammurabi canceled the debts multiple times during his reign as king. Professor Hudson says, going all the way back to the earliest civilization acknowledged, conventional historians point to Sumer as the earliest civilization or one of the earliest civilizations. And Professor Hudson writes in this book, this is a direct quote, in 3rd millennium Sumer, paying debts was increasingly beyond the ability of many families. Sumer's solution was to periodically cancel those debts at sacred festivals. So there was a sacred component to the cancellation of debts, and there was a periodic component. It was a cyclical cancellation. After a certain period of time, debts would be canceled as a sacred obligation. Our modern world has reversed matters by sanctifying the payment of debts, not their cancellation. So we've turned paying debts into everyone's sacred obligation. That's what the hijackers of the Bible, oh, we can't cancel the debts. That would go against the Bible. No, you've got it backwards. The modern world has turned it upside down by sanctifying the payment back of the creditor rather than sanctifying the cancellation of debts, which is what we find in the most ancient pattern given to all these cultures around the world. And Professor Hudson shows it wasn't just Sumer. In ancient Egypt, the Heb-Sed festival, which happened every 30 years, which is the return of Saturn by the way, and Saturn ruled over a golden age. Professor Hudson talks about that in this book, the golden age, the cancellation of the debts. It happened at the Heb-Sed festival in ancient Egypt. This is a depiction of the pharaoh Zoser at his Heb-Sed festival. In the ancient civilizations, they would cancel the debts. When a new ruler came, they would cancel the debts. In Egypt, if the ruler ruled for more than 30 years, he would symbolically come back as a new ruler. He would do this festival where he renewed his youth and came back, and it was like, oh, let's crown him again as a new king. Well, a new king, he's a new man, he's a new king, he's a new pharaoh. Well, that means cancel the debts. That's what the Heb-Sed festival was about. It was about a new king, and when you have a new king, he cancels all the debts. And it was a sacred ceremony. It was in accordance with the pattern of the gods, the pattern of the heavens. They held it every 30 years. Those are the cycles of the heavens. The ancient world observed the cycles and the ancient wisdom that was passed down. I don't know where Sumer got it from. It's from something even more ancient. But then we had this catastrophe where the ancient wisdom was turned on its head, and now we've reversed matters, and we've made the paying back of the debtor to the creditor sacred, and we've totally forgotten about and ignored the cancellation of debts. The whole banking function, if you understand it, if you understand the way money actually works, that understanding is what gives these private creditors their power, and they're currently devouring the West. That same power, that same function that gives private banking its power, understood properly, takes away their power. Modern monetary theory or modern money theory explains that the government does not need taxes or bonds in order to finance its spending. This is one of the central understandings of modern money theory. Here's a very important paper from 1998. You can find the whole thing online to read in its entirety by Stephanie Bell. That was her maiden name. Stephanie Kelton wrote this paper with the title, "Can Taxes and Bonds Finance Government Spending?" And the answer is no. Government spending is not financed by taxes, nor is it financed by bonds. What are bonds? Bonds are Wall Street. Bonds are private lending, or that's the way they're popularly understood and taught. If you go get a Wall Street job, you'll be taught that bonds are government borrowing money and paying interest on it. Well, who are they borrowing it from? Oh, the people who buy the bonds, which is Wall Street and their billionaire clients who buy the bonds. Primarily, it's very wealthy people who own millions of dollars or billions of dollars of government bonds. So the common understanding is that those millionaires and billionaires buying bonds are enabling the government to spend, along with all the tax dollars. Modern money theory, modern monetary theory, MMT, if you understand it, you've got the weapon to overthrow this whole evil system of private credit and usury that the Bible and the other ancient scriptures and systems and myths of the world teach as a central evil to be understood and prevented and destroyed. So let's talk briefly about this. The government calls its income government revenues, just like a business has revenues or sales, but for governments, those revenues are almost entirely taxes. There's a few fees and other things that are called by other names, but the vast bulk of it is taxes. Now, if the government spending is higher than its revenues, then technically that is called a deficit. The difference between spending and revenues, that difference, that space, is a deficit. The government has spent more than it has taxed, and it has a deficit. So let's put that down on the negative. We'll put that down here on the below the line. That's taking away from the balance sheet. It's got a deficit. The deficit is because the government spent more than it taxed. And you hear a lot of politicians talking about the deficit. Oh, the deficit. Deficits are just morally bad. They're just automatically evil. They're imbued with this, moral. It's as if having a deficit is automatically immoral. No, actually, we'll talk about that in a moment. It's not. But if the government were to reduce its spending, we could imagine the government potentially spending less than it takes in revenues. Then it would have what's called a surplus. It would actually be bringing in more revenues than it's spending in taxes. Is this a good situation? Is this morally good? Like surpluses are morally good and deficits are morally bad? No. If you think about it, if the government constantly runs a surplus, what's going to happen to the money that the people have? If the government is constantly taxing more than it's spending, it is taking money out of the system. It's removing money from the system. Just think about it. A government that constantly taxes more than it spends will eventually suck all of the money out of the system to where nobody will have any money. You can't argue with this. This is exactly the way it works. The government sucking money in through taxes and not spending it back will eventually suck all the money out of the system. So now you understand that when the government spends more than it taxes, it's actually putting money into the system. The government's deficit actually pumps money into the system. The deficit itself is the money in our pockets. It is the money that's out floating around in the system. That's why this piece of paper here is called a dollar bill. What's a dollar bill? What's a bill? Bills, notes, and bonds, you learn this if you go work on Wall Street, are forms of debt. They're a debt instrument. Bills, notes, and bonds. And if you look closely at the top of your dollar bill, you'll see the words Federal Reserve Note. We call it a dollar bill, but it's really a dollar note. It's a Federal Reserve note. It should be coming from the Treasury, but the government has created this private entity known as the Federal Reserve. It's been basically deputized by the government like a deputy in an old Western movie. It's been given a star to wear. It's been given this power. Didn't need to be given this power, but the government decided to create Federal Reserve. But those are government bills, notes. They represent a debt, not a debt owed by the people, a debt of the government. They're a liability of the government. That's why to the government, they are a note. They are a note promising to pay something. They're actually a form of debt by the government. So the deficit itself is written out as notes or bills. And actually in Australia, all the money is called notes. So there's a $50 note from Australia. But the fact that they're called bills or notes tells you that they are some sort of a debt instrument. And just like a bond is also a debt instrument. Bills, notes, and bonds, they're terms used on Wall Street for the shorter period debts are usually called bills, and then longer ones are called notes, and then the longest ones are called bonds, but they're all basically synonyms of one another. A bond is a debt instrument, a note is a debt instrument, a bill is a debt instrument. Who is the debtor? Not you and me, the government. So the money in the system is a government debt. It's a promise by the government to pay back something to the holder of that note or that bond. And it's spelled out on the bond. The government will pay back $5,000 plus 8%. This is an 8% treasury note. It's going to pay some interest. Your dollar bill and your $50 note that are shown over there, they're not going to pay you any interest. But they're all government debt. The notes and the bills, the paper money that we carry around, you can hold that dollar in your jacket pocket for 10 years. You'll never get any interest paid on it. A bond, the government will pay you interest on it. What will the government give you in exchange for the $1 bill or the $50 note? It will give you release from your liability. What's your liability? Taxes. Taxes are assets to the government. They're a revenue to the government and a liability to you. Every year you get a tax liability. How do you get out of that liability? You give them an asset. You give them a note. You give them a bill. If your tax liability is $100, you can pay that back with $100 of bills. And they'll say, okay, that bill obligates me to extinguish $1 worth of tax liability on your part. So if you have $100 of tax liability, you give me 100 of those bills, I'll extinguish it. That's the actual function of that money. The government does not need your taxes in order to spend. In fact, you got those dollars because the government spent first. First, the government spends the money out into the system, then it collects some of it back in the form of taxes. If it collects back more than it's spent out, eventually it'll take all the money out of the system. But if it is spending more than it is bringing back in, then it's pumping money out into the system. And that money is sitting out in the system in the form of dollar bills or $50 bills or $100 bills, and in the form of bonds, which pay interest. Does the government need to put some of it in the form of bonds that pay interest? No. That's like an added gift to the bondholder. And the government just creates that money that it pays in interest as well. The government creates the money first and then taxes back some of it. It does not need the taxes first before it can spend. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You're not allowed to create $1 bills or $50 notes. If you do that, you will go to jail. The only way you can get them is from money that the government originally spent. Understanding this dynamic is the key to understanding modern money theory, and it is so important. And if you don't believe me from this short video, I recommend you go check out probably the best place to read about it in the shortest amount of time is to go to Warren Mosler's website and read his book, which he has online in its entirety in various different file formats for free and in various different languages, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. And here's how to find it. You go to his website, which is Mosler Economics. You go to the page that's called Mandatory Readings. That's on the menu there. You can see the menu just beneath the picture of the ocean. And then you look for the 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. And the way to find his website is simply to go to moslereconomics.com. Then you can read his whole book and understand this. Why is that important? What it means is the government can never run out of money. The metaphor that MMT theorists, including Warren Mosler and Stephanie Kelton, sometimes use is, it's like points on the scoreboard. In a basketball game, the scoreboard will never run out of points. It's impossible to run out of points. They just put them up on the board. If you have the power to put up points on the board, you can put up as many points as you want to. You're not going to run out of points. A good metaphor that Warren Mosler uses to explain this is, let's pretend in a family that a dad or a mom or the dad and the mom together decide to create some family money just for the family to use because they're trying to get the kids to do some chores around the house. And they say, listen, kids, I'm going to institute a new modern money policy right here within the house. All you kids, you owe me chores. And the kids will say, yeah, right, I've heard that before. And you say, no, if you don't pay me $100 family bucks per month or per week or whatever, then I'm going to take away your video games. I'm going to turn off the routers and none of us will have internet until I get my tax of 100 family bucks per week. And now the kids are paying attention. Wait a minute. How am I going to get family bucks? Well, first I'm going to have to spend them out into the economy. I'm the government in this example. So I'll just use my business card here. So I'll use Don Draper's business card. He says, look, if you get a hold of a business card, that's going to be worth 10 family bucks. Each business card is 10 family bucks, but it's got to be signed. I'm going to put my signature on it so that I know that it's really a family buck. You didn't just sneak into my desk drawer and take some of my business cards. So I'm going to sign it. When I put my signature on it, that's worth 10 family bucks. And every time you do the dishes, I'm going to give you 10 family bucks. Every time you wash my car, I'll give you 30 family bucks. Every time you, I don't know what, whatever chore you want them to do, you put different prices on it and you pay them family bucks. And now the kids, they've got a liability each week. We can make a balance sheet for them. This is a balance sheet. On one side, we have the assets. On the other side, we have the liabilities. And I say, kids, I'm going to just create a liability on your side of the balance sheet. On the liability side, every week, you're going to get a 100 family buck liability. And if you don't pay that off, you're going to jail. Well, not literal jail. You're going to video game jail. You will not be allowed to use video games, social media, whatever, until I get my 100 family bucks. And the kids say, okay, great. I'm going to start. What jobs do you want me to do? And then they start getting family bucks for doing jobs. Oh, I got, 50, 25, 70. Once they've got over 100, they're starting to save up family bucks. They can start trading amongst themselves. Hey, I don't feel like doing the dishes. Hey, Johnny, you want to do my dishes? I'll pay you 20 family bucks because I've got more than I need for staying out of social media jail for this week. So they can actually start trading family bucks amongst themselves. They could also, if I'm a generous dad or mom, I could say, you know what, if you got extra assets on your side of the balance sheet, you've done so many chores that you've racked up so many family bucks that you don't need to spend them all, you can put some in family buck savings where I'll pay 3% interest per year or whatever, and they'll start actually earning additional family bucks. But I'm the one who creates family bucks, so I can easily pay that interest. In fact, eventually I don't even need to use the business cards with my signature on them anymore. We could just do this all electronically. We could say, it's kind of tiring trading around my business cards and with my signatures on it. Let's just do this electronically after a while. Once the kids have gotten the hang of it, we'll just keep track of your assets in a balance sheet and become a cashless society. That's not necessarily bad as long as the government is honest about it. But notice, the assets for the kids are exactly the same as the dollar bills or the $50 notes that are floating around in modern economies. In fact, if you look closely, you'll see that there's signatures on those bills and notes. In this system, the dad or the mom, they'll never run out of family bucks. They are not constrained. They can always get business cards and sign them, or just a piece of paper and sign them and say, okay, this is a family buck, kid. This is what you need to give to me in order to be able to stay out of social media jail or video game jail. Why is that so important? Because this cuts the power of the private lenders, the money changers, the usurers. The sovereign government that makes the money is not constrained, is not limited, can spend in order to protect the resources and build up the nation and protect the poor and the needy from the moneylenders. The moneylenders who want to charge interest and make a living through usury, they want to constrain the government's ability to spend because the government being constrained enables them to seize the resources. This is what you have to understand. So if this system, let's just imagine that the kids have earned enough family bucks, the family could start paying interest on savings accounts. They could say, okay, kids, you can start putting your money into a savings account and saving up extra, and we'll pay interest on that. The government creates bonds. That's just another form of bills and notes. Instead of dollar bills and $50 notes, the government can also generously offer to pay interest on excess family bucks that have been spent out. If the kids have excess bucks sitting around, the government can say, well, here, put it into this type of account and I'll pay 8% interest on it. And the bonds are also signed by the Secretary of the Treasury down at the bottom there. You can see that. It's the exact same. They are just, bills and notes are just the same as government bonds. They're a form of money that was created by the government. And the interest is created by the government. The government is not constrained in its spending. And I know this is a shock to people that might be listening, especially if you're a gold standard advocate. What is a gold standard? A gold standard is a way of limiting the government, or it's thought of as a way of limiting the government. Oh, you can't print more money than you have gold. So it's a way to say, we want to constrain the government from being able to spend. Why would you want to do that? Banks want the government to be constrained. Private banks, private lenders do not want the government to have unlimited money creation power, because the private lenders want to fill in the gaps and become the ones who are lending the money, making interest off of lending. But if the government takes care of the people to a point where their standards of living are built up by the government's spending, there's going to be less need for private lenders. They don't want the government to be able to spend enough to keep the people out of debt. They want the people to go into debt to them. So you have to understand assets and liabilities at least a little bit. For the kids, the bucks are an asset. But for the government or for the parents, those family bucks are actually a liability. The kids have a liability, a tax. Oh, I've got to come up with 100 family bucks a week. That's a liability to the kids. So they've got to scramble around and get assets. Those assets are an asset to the kids, but a liability to the parents. So everything on a balance sheet, it's like a red light or a green light. On an intersection, a red light is only red to one direction. Every red light is a green light to someone else. There's a green light to people going this way, there's a red light to that way. That's the way you've got to think of assets and liabilities. The assets are simultaneously green to the kids, an asset, and red to the parents, a liability. All those dollar bills out there in the system are an asset to us, the people, and a liability to the government. This whole thing about, oh yeah, dollars, they're a Babylonian system to put us into debt. No, they're not. They're an asset to you. The government's dollars are an asset to the people and a liability to the government. In exchange, when we give those assets to the government, they have to extinguish our tax liability, exactly like this scenario that I described of your family bucks. But the government creates the assets. Well, liabilities to them, assets to us. They'll never run out of the ability to create the dollars any more than in a family buck system. The parents will run out of the ability to add more family bucks to the kids. If the kids do the chores, the parents can pay them. This is exactly how the money system works. It's how it's always worked, even in ancient times. It's called MMT, but substantially this is the same way that money was made back in the days of the Roman Empire, back in the days of ancient Greece. The government stamps the coins, and then it says, okay, I will accept that to extinguish your liabilities. These coins are a liability to the government, and an asset to the people, and the people turn them in to extinguish their liabilities to the government. The reason I put in the bonds here and this part about the kids being able to put their money into a Family Bucks account that earns 3% interest, that's a pure giveaway by the state, by the government that issues the money. They don't have to pay you interest. The paying of the interest on bonds is a complete gift by the government. That's a gift to the kids to earn 3% interest or 5% interest or 8% interest. It is not because the government needs that money. Oh, I've got to offer bonds so that I can get money, so that I can fund the government. That's what Stephanie Kelton's paper was. Taxes and bonds do not fund the government. As you can see from this example, the Family Bucks does not need the kids to put their money into savings accounts in order for the family to be able to create Family Bucks. It's a complete gift to the kids to offer them some interest on their savings. That's what bonds are in the modern money system. The money is created first by the sovereign government, so they do not need to issue bonds, but they've created rules that say, okay, well, if we spend more than we take in, then we're going to create this many bonds. That's actually just a gift to Wall Street. Bonds are a gift to Wall Street and to billionaires. Billionaires want, because they've got so many extra Family Bucks, they want to park them somewhere that's going to earn 8%. That the bonds are a gift to them to earn that extra money. Now, if you look at the U.S. budget, the biggest item on the budget is $1.6 trillion in 2024 to Medicare, followed closely by $1.5 trillion to Social Security, followed by national defense, $1.3 trillion. And actually, national defense probably spent more than $1.3 trillion because certain items like billions of dollars, $200 billion given to the Ukraine, billions of dollars given to Israel to enable them to bomb Gaza, isn't even included in that $1.3 trillion. So national defense budget is actually larger than $1.3 trillion, but the next item, almost as big as national defense spending, is net interest on the debt. $1.1 trillion. So almost as much as the nominal amount of national defense spending, almost as much as the $1.3 trillion nominal amount of national defense spending, was $1.1 trillion paid out to bondholders. So that is an enormous giveaway to Wall Street and to billionaires or to wealthy investors who own government bonds. I'm not saying that the U.S. should get rid of that. I'm just saying you never hear anybody talking about that. You hear Wall Street saying, I wish that the government weren't allowed to spend so much. We should go back to a gold standard to constrain them from spending so much. What they're really complaining about is they don't want the government to be able to spend on things that compete with their lending. They don't want the government to be able to spend on university education. They don't want the government to be able to spend on keeping the roads in good condition, keeping the post office running efficiently. Why? Because if the roads are in bad repair, then private equity can buy the roads and say, oh, look, the government can't afford these roads. We'll buy them up and charge tolls on them. That's the reason. They want to constrain government spending in places that competes with their usury type Wall Street interests, their parasitical interests. They want to gobble up the roads and the bridges by choking off the government's ability to spend on it. They want to issue out student debt, and they don't want the government giving out scholarships that will take people out of the need for student debt for universities. They want to issue out expensive healthcare insurance They don't want the government to provide universal health care. If the government spent enough to provide universal health care, then what would happen to all the private insurers, the big giant health insurance companies, enormous multi-hundreds of billion-dollar revenue companies? Yes, there might still be some people who wanted to buy additional private insurance, but there'd be a whole lot of people who would say, oh, well, government insurance is good enough for me. So Wall Street wants to constrain the ability of the government to spend, but they never talk about, well, oh my goodness, they're spending so much interest on bonds. Look at that. It's like the fourth largest item on the budget is interest to bondholders. Do you ever hear Wall Street screaming about that? No. It's an absolute giveaway to bondholders. As I just explained, it's not a necessary function, and Wall Street never complains about that. It is larger than the government spends on healthcare. Not larger than Medicare, but larger than it spends on health programs, and much larger than it spends on income security programs, only $684 billion, 0.684 trillion, $684 billion on things like, these are things like food stamps for people in financial insecurity, food insecurity. And if we go over here to education, it's only $264 billion. So far less than the government just gives away to Wall Street in the form of bonds and to bondholders in the form of interest. 1.1 trillion on interest in 2024, 264 billion, 0.264 trillion on education. And unreported data, we don't even know what this was spent for. 424 billion spent on, well, we're not going to tell you what that was spent on. Twice as much as was spent on education. So the thing to understand is the government is not constrained in what it spends on, but if you constrain it, then that gives more room for usury. The U.S. student debt burden, this is a graph showing its growth since 2007, 2008. Look, when I was going through school, student debt was not even talked about because nobody had it. There was no student debt. The price of going to a university in the United States has 10x'd since about 2003. This graph only goes down to 2007 because there wasn't that much student debt to speak of in 2003. There was none in the 90s. Going to a college was affordable in the 90s without student debt. But now, if you make university student loans, then the university can charge more for tuition. Back in 2003, the average cost of a year of tuition for a state school was about $2,500. Today, it's around $25,000 for the same state school. $2,500 to $25,000 per year. Well, $2,500 per year, you could actually pay that as a student going to school and waiting tables, or going to school and having some kind of job on the side. You could actually cover $2,500 a year yourself. But there's not that many students who can come up with $25,000 a year while going to university at the same time. And there's not that many families that have $100,000 just sitting around in an account for each child going to school for 4 years at $25,000 a year. And that's a state school. That's not a private school. That's a state school. So if the tuition has gone up to $25,000, you've got to get student debt to pay that, most people, because you can't cover it yourself as a student. And most families don't have $100,000 lying around, $25,000 a year for 4 years. The only reason that this tuition was able to go up 10x is because suddenly they created this thing called student debt, where banks could make loans to students, where the bank makes the interest on the debt, but if the student defaults, the government says, oh, we'll step in and back you up on any defaults. Well, what bank isn't going to take that? The bank is now tripping over itself to loan to as many students as possible because it's a win-win. Either the student pays me back the money with the interest, or if the student defaults, the government pays me. So it's like a complete giveaway to the banks. If the banks are now tripping over themselves to make loans, then the universities can raise their prices. Back in the day when there were no student loans, the tuitions were $2,500 because if the universities tried to charge $25,000, nobody would pay it because there weren't student loans. But now that there are student loans backed up by the government, banks are tripping over themselves to make the student loans. So of course, the universities can now charge $25,000. They just say, well, put it on credit. The exact same thing has happened with the cost of cars. Back in the 60s, nobody borrowed to buy a car. That was considered actually an immoral thing to do, or a questionable thing to do. You didn't buy cars on credit. Well, now nobody can afford even a piece of garbage car without going into debt for it. Even a used car, people have to get a loan for it. The more the banks are willing to loan, the higher the price will go up. If loans are available for university tuition, then universities can charge more. Especially if the government will back those loans, then the price of the tuition will go up. The price of a car, or the price of a university year of tuition, or the price of a house, as Professor Michael Hudson teaches us, is whatever someone is willing to loan. If the banks are willing to loan that much, then the price will go up to that amount. That's why the cost of education has gone up so much. That's why the student debt line looks the way it does. That line is actually a percentage line. Here's a dollar line. Average student loan, the average debt, and this is the average. Remember, there's students who are in debt way above this line, but the average student was in debt around $20,000 of debt in 2008. Around $20,000 of debt. That's like walking out of college with a $20,000 credit card debt just for going to college. Well, that was 2008. Look at it in 2024. The average student loan debt burden coming out of college is around $38,000, $39,000. $38,375 is the average at the end of 2024. That's because if banks are willing to lend, then the price of that item is going to go up to the amount that's being loaned. So let's talk about why home prices have gone completely out of control. It's because if banks are willing to loan that much, then that's how much the prices will go up to. In my hometown of San Mateo, California, so I know San Mateo pretty well. I grew up there. I went to high school there. And where I'm showing you right now this is down by the train tracks. This is down by the liquor store. In fact, I'm circling where the liquor store used to be. Of course, there were a lot of liquor stores, but this is like the liquor store down by the train tracks with kind of like bars on the window. This is not the top end of town. This is the more working class part of town. But as you can see, the houses, like right next to the liquor store here, the old liquor store, it's not a liquor store anymore, today are listing on Zillow for 1.4 million, 1.9 million, 2.13 million, 2.17 million. Well, let's have a look. What do these houses look like? What are we talking about? These are 2-bedroom, 1 bath, built in the 1950s, 900 square foot, $1.37 million. Why? Why is that? It's because of the financialization and the ability to get a loan for a 2-bedroom house for $1.3 million. There's a lot of factors, but this has to do with the financialization and the power of the banks to create money. When a bank makes a loan, it's actually creating money. Just like I said, it's like a deputy in the Western movies. From the sovereign government that creates the money, the banks are given the power to use that same money creation capability. That's how they're making these loans privately for their own private profit. They're for-profit private entities, private corporations, with the ability to create money. Well, not out of thin air, out of the house going from $600,000 to $1.3 million, which is completely fictitious. It's a function of the financialization itself that drives up the price, because the banks would much rather loan. Look, this house was built in the 50s. When it first sold, it sold for about $5,000. Now it's still 900 square feet, and it's 70 years old. It hasn't gotten better. It hasn't gotten bigger. All it's gotten is older, but it's gone from being quote unquote worth $5,000 to being worth $1.3 million. The banks benefit tremendously from that gain, because now maybe they're writing a mortgage for $900,000 or $1 million and getting 5%. So which would you rather have? 5% of $1 million as your interest payment every year? Yeah. That means this borrower is paying $50,000 a year in interest, whereas when it was first sold at $5,000, I don't care if you charge 10% interest on $5,000, that's a lot less than 5% on $1 million. When the prices of the real estate go up, the banks that are making money off of usury, off of interest, are making more money. And so are the insurance companies, because now they say, oh, it looks like you've got a $1.3 million house right there. You better pay some high premiums, because we're going to pay you back if it burns down. We've got to cover a $1.3 million house. That's going to cost you a lot more than covering a $5,000 house or a $50,000 house or even a $600,000 house. So the finance and insurance and real estate sectors all work together, as Michael Hudson explains, to make money off of this usurious system. Now, these are some of the houses in what used to be very working class neighborhoods. If we go to a different part of San Mateo, this is a little closer to where I grew up. This is up the hill in Laurelwood. And these are newer houses. These are some of the houses where I used to go to birthday parties of kids who lived here when I was growing up. These are just ordinary middle-class family houses back in the 70s. But today, $2.23 million, $2.88 million, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,890 square foot house, $2.9 million. I've got news for you. If you think that America is going to ever reindustrialize, you can't pay middle-class workers enough to live in a house, an ordinary middle-class house from the 70s, if they've got to hold down a mortgage on a $2.9 million 3-bedroom house. Until this gets fixed, you cannot fix the rest of the economy. You cannot create more industry until you tackle the financialization and the banking profit that comes from driving up real estate to levels that make it impossible to ever reindustrialize. The people who can afford to live in these houses are the people who are tapped into monopoly type industries such as Google. Professor Hudson talks about the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. Yeah, if you work for a finance company, then you can live in a $2.9 million 3-bedroom house. Or There's an additional letter on that. It's fire plus M, monopolies. If you work in the healthcare system, that's a monopoly. If you work in the university system, that's a monopoly. And if you work in most of the tech industries, those are actually largely government-sponsored monopolies. Google was heavily government funded by the CIA, and it is a monopoly. Amazon was given monopoly powers to sell their books without charging taxes until they'd driven out most of the competition, including even some of the biggest booksellers, and then they had to start charging taxes on their books. They were given monopoly privileges. You're not going to bring back honest industry if workers are having to pay these kinds of prices to live in a 3-bedroom house. You're never going to be able to pay loads of middle-class workers enough to pay the mortgages on $2.9 million 3-bedroom houses in basically the ordinary middle-class part of San Mateo where I grew up. This is an advertisement by Prudential Life Insurance. They've got this road race going on where they've set up this big gate that says, "Are you completely prepared for retirement? Go through this side if the answer is no. Go through that side if the answer is yes." And as you can see, almost all the runners are going through the no side. Why? Because they're not prepared for retirement. What does that mean? There's the Prudential symbol. That means you need to work with our financial advisors to buy some Prudential life insurance and put your money in some Prudential investments so that you'll be able to have your same standard of living when you're retired. Why do we need that system? Because people don't understand MMT. This is a complete giveaway to the financial sector. Why do all these workers have to give their money to Prudential to earn fees on it, exorbitant life insurance fees and money management fees, just so that Prudential will then enable them to be secure in their retirement? Is that the kind of system that we want? Let me show you an older Prudential advertisement to really drive home this point. This is from the 1950s, and this is an actual magazine advertisement from Prudential. Same symbol. You can see the Rock of Gibraltar right there. And it says at the top, "Two widows. The husband of one let his life insurance lapse." Underline lapse. Who are the two widows? Well, let's look around. I don't see two widows in this. Oh, I see. There's one woman waving to her kids. She's happy. She's living in her nice middle-class house there. She's got encyclopedia on the shelves there. There's a big encyclopedia. Who's the other woman? The maid. The woman dressed in the French maid's outfit. Obviously, she's also a widow. Here's two widows. The one who's a maid, her husband didn't pay Prudential the premiums every single month in case he died. He let his policy lapse. Now she's going to have to work, whereas the other one, she gets to retire in happiness and waving to her kids. "Oh, hey, how's it going, kids?" Is that the system that we want? You pay Prudential every month or you're screwed. You pay or you're not going to have a retirement. Wait, why do I have to pay Prudential for that again? Because the financial industry doesn't want you to understand MMT. MMT says the government creates the money. That means that for those people whose husbands die early, or who have some kind of medical emergency, or who reach the age of retirement, you don't need Wall Street, including Prudential and the other Wall Street companies, to take care of them. The government can create a retirement asset in their account every single month or every single day. You can pay them a certain amount every day. You can pay them a certain amount every month. How much? I don't know. Let Congress debate about that. Let the elected leaders debate about that. Should a retired person, when they reach the age of 65, get $10,000 in their account every month, or $5,000 in their account every month, or $8,000? I don't know. Let Congress debate it. But the government could create that money directly in their account every single month. If you understand MMT, you understand there's absolutely no problem in their doing that. But instead, let's create a convoluted system where they take their money after they've earned it and send it over to Prudential or these other Wall Street companies to hold on to it for 50 years, making fees off of it, money management fees every year. And then when they reach the age of retirement, they can ask themselves the question, am I completely prepared for retirement? I'm not sure yet. Maybe I should give Prudential even more money to take care of me later that I take out. In other words, it's being given over to Wall Street completely unnecessarily. The government could create it directly in the account of widows, orphans, and retired people, or people who've been, injured so they can't work anymore. All right, well, poof, $10,000 appears in your account every month. That's created there by the government. No need to go all the way over to Wall Street first and pay all the college tuitions of all the kids of the Wall Street brokers, and then it comes back to you after all the fees have been sucked out of it for 50 years. And even so, you're still wondering, am I completely prepared for retirement? I don't know. It's a complete giveaway to Wall Street. Same as bonds are a complete giveaway to Wall Street. There is no need for bonds to, quote, fund the government. And there's no need for Prudential to be the ones who decide between the two widows. Oh yeah, two widows. One, her husband didn't pay us. Is that the kind of society you want? Like, she's screwed because she didn't pay her fees to Prudential every year? That's disgusting. That's disgusting. But that is the system that you get if you don't understand MMT. Yes, it enables Wall Street. It enables them. But if you understand it, it can also destroy them. If enough people understood this, they would say, wait a minute, that's a horrific system. I don't want that. How much money do I need to retire? Call us. We'll help you set it up. How are you going to maintain income during your retirement? But not only is that a horrific system for individuals, it's a horrific system because it empowers these gigantic financial firms way beyond what they would normally be empowered if the government were to just create the money in people's accounts without that giant detour to Wall Street. You would not have this situation where these money management firms, they're largely managing enormous pension funds where people have put in their money to a Wall Street firm because that's the way the system is set up, for the Wall Street firm to sit on it and charge fees on it until they then pay it out in retirement. You don't need that system. It's a complete giveaway, but that system has created this table. This is from Wikipedia. I just took this screenshot today. This shows the assets under management of the largest financial management companies. Remember, their institutional investors are primarily pension funds, university pension funds, public employee pension funds. CalPERS is one of the biggest pools of money on the planet. That's the California Public Employees Retirement System. These firms have these trillions of dollars because of the system that I just explained. MMT is like the most horrific thing in the world to these companies, because if enough people understood it, they would say, wait a minute, we don't need BlackRock and Vanguard and Fidelity to create secure retirements for workers who have reached the age of retirement, or to create security for widows and orphans and people who've been injured at the workplace. You do not need this gigantic giveaway to Wall Street if you understand MMT. So MMT is what enables these firms to have access to tremendous amounts of credit, but it is also what could destroy this whole system if enough people understood it. So how many assets under management does BlackRock have? That's in US dollars and in billions. So 10,473 in billions means they have 10 trillion, 473 billion under management. Look, 473 billion under management is an enormous amount. They've got 10 trillion and 473 billion under management. If you have 1 billion under management, 1 billion, and you charge 1% per year, 1% per year on a billion, you know how much that is? 1% per year on a billion. Well, 10% would be 100 million. 1% would be 10 million. So on $1 billion of assets under management, 1% is 10 million a year. I could get 10 investment professionals together managing $1 billion and pay them each $1 million a year on 1 billion under management. It wouldn't really take 10 people to do that job, but I could assemble 10 investment professionals, get $1 billion under management, charge 1%, that's 10 million a year, and we'd each get $1 million a year if we split it equally. If we had 100 billion under management, we'd get $1 billion a year at 1%. $1 billion a year. Well, our firm would get $1 billion a year, then we'd have to split it 10 ways. So we'd each get 100 million a year. Well, those are pretty good. Those are pretty good salaries. I could probably afford one of those houses for that. This company, BlackRock, has 10 trillion, 473 billion dollars in assets under management. Just at 473 billion, 1% is 4.7 billion a year. 1%, that's just on the 473 billion. Then they've got 10 trillion on top of that. 10.4 trillion. I remember I was working at Merrill Lynch when Merrill Lynch bought BlackRock. BlackRock did not even have $1 trillion under management. They didn't even have $500 billion under management. This is an out-and-out explosion of the financial sector. This is because you've given your country over to usurers. This is totally unnecessary. This is a total giveaway of the national wealth to Wall Street, because Wall Street has this much money, they can then buy politicians. If BlackRock has 10.4 trillion, we saw the numbers for the American budget expenses. The US is not spending more than $1.5 trillion on the entire defense industry. On all of the military is less than 2 trillion. BlackRock has almost 10.5 trillion under management. Vanguard has 9.3 trillion under management. Every single number on this chart is in the trillions. Every number to the left of the comma is a trillion. So all the way down at the bottom, T. Rowe Price, they've got $1.485 trillion of assets under management. So the understanding of MMT helps you understand why you don't need Prudential and all these other companies. Oh, there's Prudential just above T. Rowe Price, $1.5 trillion under management. You don't need them to take care of widows and orphans. You don't need them to take care of people's retirement. That is completely a giveaway to Wall Street. But not only is it a giveaway, it gives them tremendous power to dictate to politicians because they have way more money than they could possibly spend. They can use that money to buy politicians to make sure that this system benefits the finance sector, to make sure that home prices do not go down, to make sure that the student loan situation does not change. Abraham Lincoln, when he was solicited by many friends, he says, to become a candidate for the legislature of Illinois, when his friends came to him and said, hey, why don't you run for Congress in Illinois, state legislature? He said, okay, I'm going to lay out my 3 policies, my politics, what I stand for. Number 1, I am in favor of a national bank. That was his number 1 policy. I'm in favor of a national bank. That means not private. That means not Wall Street. That means I believe that just like water, clean water, good roads, bridges, railroads, those things are part of the infrastructure and should be provided by the government that's for the people, so is credit. The national bank, that idea means credit should be controlled by the government, not by Wall Street. If we need to build a bridge, we don't need to go to Wall Street and get a bond to build that bridge. We can create the money ourselves. Abraham Lincoln famously created greenbacks during the Civil War, basically modern monetary theory. He was in favor of a national bank. Well, if you're in favor of that, you don't want Wall Street to run your country, to create the situation that I just showed you on the previous slides. And Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head while he watched the theater because the banking interests, basically the city of London, did not want what Abraham Lincoln was arguing for, a national bank, greenbacks. He was killed. After that is when Wall Street took over America. The era of Wall Street was after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He wanted to free the slaves. He wanted to build national infrastructure. He wanted to help the people. His second point, I'm in favor of the internal improvement system. That means building good infrastructure for the people, good clean water for the people of Flint, Michigan. That's what I'm for. And the way you do that is with a national bank, not with Wall Street Bank. Wall Street wants to choke that off. The less that the government can spend, the more that Wall Street can make money. If we create universities that are paid for by the federal government, if the federal government says, you know what, state schools, tuition shall be free for anyone who's qualified to get into that school, what's that going to do to the student loan industry? It's going to crush it. Good, because the banks are just making free money off of indebting college students for something that should be considered infrastructure. So Abraham Lincoln said, I'm in favor of a national bank, not for-profit banks. And I'm in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. Well, that's for a manufacturing nation. The U.S. is no longer a manufacturing nation because you can't afford to have workers when housing prices are that high. That's why Wall Street shipped all the manufacturing off to places like China and Vietnam. Now, some people will say, wait a minute, banks charge interest because they have to stay in business. They have to charge interest because some of those loans default for whatever reason. People don't pay them back. There's bad weather, whatever, on the crops. So, of course, banks have to stay in business, so they have to charge interest. A national bank, the beauty of that is it doesn't need to charge high interest in order to stay in business. Why? If you understand MMT, the federal government can create money. So a national bank doesn't have to run at a profit. A national bank can create money actually at a loss. And if there are people who are in debt that, let's say there's a COVID pandemic or there's a drought in a certain state and all the farmers can't pay their debt for that year, the national bank could say, oh, well, not only do we give you a low interest loan below market interest rates, but we're going to cancel your mortgage payments for that year because of COVID or because of a drought or because of whatever natural disaster. Private banking can't do that and stay in business, but a national bank could. That's why roads should not be run by private equity. They have to turn a profit. Roads can be run by the government. Internal roads and bridges can be run by the government at a loss if you understand MMT. The government can run a deficit. And if roads are falling apart, that shows that the government is not spending enough. People who are screaming about the deficit should stop screaming about it until we have beautiful roads and bridges and railroads and high-speed rail and internal systems that are actually working and well repaired, and until we have full employment. If you've got unemployment, then the government is not spending enough. Because there are times when the private sector, for recession reasons or whatever, has to shed workers. You can't lay that on the private sector to employ everybody, but the government can employ everybody. They can say, oh, well, when people are unemployed, we can put them to work repairing the roads or taking care of people in the hospitals or doing the landscaping at the public schools or the universities or whatever it is. The government can create a jobs guarantee program to absorb anybody who's unemployed. So if you've got unemployment, that means the government is not spending enough, by definition. MMT theorists have worked all this out. So Abraham Lincoln, when he says, I've only got 3 points, but they're big ones, and number one is a national bank, this is what he's talking about. Don't let your country get taken over by Wall Street. And they killed him. And Wall Street took over the country, as you can see from the preceding slides. But MMT, which Abraham Lincoln apparently understood back in the 1860s, because he was creating greenbacks without going to Wall Street and asking for bonds, without going to the City of London and asking for debt, he understood MMT. It's not just modern, it's actually ancient. As we finish off, I will address, why do we need taxes at all then? Do we even need taxes under MMT? If taxes aren't funding the spending, then why do we need taxes? Well, in order to answer that, I'm going to draw a picture. Let's imagine that this warehouse, this is an example that's given by Warren Mosler in one of his lectures and some of his writings. Imagine this warehouse contains all the goods and services produced by an economy, your nation's economy. This is everything that you can possibly buy is in this warehouse, whether it's a physical good or a service like a haircut or a taxi ride or whatever. It's all in here. And all the goods and services that are there, the people who produce them are getting the dollars, for producing them. So everything is going back and forth. I produce a lawnmower, you want to buy it, you give me money. You produce a loaf of bread and a 6-pack of beer, I want to buy that, I give you money. So the money is being circulating around. The reason why we have taxes, according to MMT, it doesn't directly fund government spending, but for the government to provision itself, it must remove some dollars from this warehouse. And here's why. First of all, why would a government need to provision itself? Well, because there is a need for national defense. If you don't produce good enough weapon systems, you won't be able to defend yourself against enemy fighter jets and bombers. If you don't have an army, you won't be able to defend yourself against invasion. If you don't create bridges and roads, people won't be able to have as effective and efficient commerce as they could have. Some businesses will go out of business because the roads and the bridges simply aren't there for them. So there is a proper role for the government to provision itself, to buy things like tanks or fighter jets. So let's draw in this box all the things that the government needs to buy. It's a subset of the total economy. We don't want the government to buy every single thing. They don't need to buy all the burritos and all the cups of coffee at every single coffee shop in the whole country. But let's say they've bought some fighter jets, some tanks, some uniforms for the soldiers, some rifles, whatever. They've bought all those things that are proper to the government to do. The U.S. Constitution enumerates 18 things that are proper for the government to do. And the government has bought some goods and services out of the economy. So I'm going to show this box here in the back. That's what the government just bought. Now, in the economy, everyone's still got the dollars that are circulating around, including for the things that the government just bought, but for all the things that they're buying and selling to each other. I create beer, I sell beer, I get dollars. I create whiskey, I sell whiskey, I get dollars. The government I create rifles, the government buys some of them, I get dollars. There's all these dollars floating around, but now there's fewer goods and services because the government just took some of them. It provisioned itself. Proper for it to do, I just said. I think it's proper for government to do certain things. Pay inspectors to make sure the food supply is actually healthy. Like people aren't putting sawdust in the cereal that they're marketing. So I'm going to pay government food inspectors to check the cereal boxes to make sure that those cornflakes aren't made with sawdust. That's proper for the government to do. So the government has removed some goods and services, but if it doesn't remove any dollars, guess what's going to happen? You've got the same amount of dollars swirling around and a whole lot fewer goods and services swirling around because the government took some of them. You're going to have inflation. So the government needs to remove some dollars to counterbalance what it removed in goods and services. Otherwise, there will be inflation as the dollars that didn't get taken away chase around fewer goods that the government did take away. So the government has to remove the proper amount of dollars. How they do that is debatable. That's what Congress, according to the Constitution, is supposed to decide. Well, we could tax people's income. No, let's not tax people's income. We want people to make income. Okay, well, we could tax cigarettes. Okay, well, we want people to smoke less. Let's tax cigarettes. That's a debate. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? I don't know. How you tax, that's debatable. But if you don't tax, you will have inflation if you remove goods and services from the economy as a government to provision yourself. If you are seeing unemployment out on the streets, that means you're taxing too much and spending too less. Like I said before, you're out of balance. You need a bigger deficit until you get rid of unemployment. Obviously, the United States is taxing too much and spending too little, which is exactly what austerity proponents want. Austerity means we want the government to spend less and tax more. We want the government to spend less on bridges. You know why? Because we want private equity to buy up those bridges so that they can make tons of money charging tolls. We want government to let roads fall apart so that private equity can buy them up and privatize the roads. We want the post office to be terrible. We don't want the government to be allowed to spend enough, because if the post office is terrible, then if I'm running FedEx and UPS, I don't have to worry about competing with the government, who is doing their proper job of running the post, which is enumerated in the Constitution. If they're doing a great job of doing that, first of all, the government doesn't have to turn a profit. So they could do it at well below cost. I could be shipping packages well below cost. UPS and FedEx could never compete with that. So they want to artificially constrain, through austerity policies, spending on the post so that they can make money instead on a function that properly belongs to the government, enumerated in the Constitution. Austerity urges higher taxes than we should have and lower spending than we should have. And that's why the United States is falling apart, because of austerity that is being pushed by the interests who are against the government doing what Abraham Lincoln said: internal improvements, a national bank. If the government were spending on universities in order to enable everybody, whether they're from a very poor family, from the inner city, whatever, everybody to get the kind of degree that they're qualified for. Let's say some kid in the inner city is a great potential engineer. If he could just go to college and afford it, he could be a great engineer, or she, and make railroads or airplanes for the nation. But because college tuition is so high, they end up just working in a coffee shop or some service job. But they could have been a great engineer, contributing with their particular talents that they were given by the gods or by God or by nature. If the government were providing enough free university education, you'd have a lot more engineers. But the student loan business, it'd be awful. If the government was providing free education, how could the poor banks make any money off of student loans? Or if the government provided free rail system for electronic payments, how could poor Visa and MasterCard make any money off the Visa rails? How could the banks make any money charging interchange on every single transaction that people do? It's a free giveaway to the banks. So hopefully this MMT explanation helps to show how this understanding undercuts the usurers, the oligarchs that want to devour the people and devour the resources given by the gods. And like I said, it's called modern monetary theory or MMT. It's really ancient monetary theory. The ancients put the gods and the goddesses on their coins because money is connected to the resources. The resources are given by the gods. And the resources given to a nation includes the men and women of that nation. This is the goddess Athena on an ancient Greek 4 drachma coin. She is the giver of gifts, of wisdom, and also of crafts like spinning and weaving, textiles. Those gifts are given by the gods. If the king doesn't prevent the oligarchs and the creditors from devouring the nation, those gifts will be gobbled up. Those people will be gobbled up. As Michael Hudson said, the Bible and the ancients used the metaphor of sodomy for usury. This coin with a goddess on it shows the proper monetary theory. The sovereign state has a right and a duty to create the money. Usurers want to prevent that so that they can starve off the spending so that they can do more lending at high interest rates and gobbling up of resources. I'm not saying that private banks should not exist. I'm not saying that. They should exist for funding inter-business activities. If a business wants to grow faster through the use of some leverage and borrowing so it can build more restaurants or more factories than it could just by saving up, there's nothing wrong with that. And that does not compete with the proper role of the government to fund things like infrastructure. But when Wall Street worms its way in and says, oh, if you want to build a bridge, you got to do a bond, now you've got a problem. Now you've got a problem. So a national bank doing its proper things doesn't prevent private banks from doing their proper things. Just like if there was a national university system, state universities, that wouldn't prevent Yale and Harvard and Dartmouth and these other private schools from saying, hey, you could go to a state school for free tuition, or you could come to us. And of course, you have to pay tuition because we're a for-profit institution, but we think we'll give you something even better. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having private universities as well as a public option to make sure that everybody can have it. And there's nothing wrong with having a public jobs guarantee program as a safety net for people who've lost their jobs in the private sector to where they can still make enough money to feed their family and keep a roof over their head. And if you did this, you would be able to lower the cost of housing as well, because that's a critical function. If a society has housing that is so expensive that people working a full-time job cannot afford a house, then you've got a problem. Back in the 70s, in the United States, in the 60s, one full-time job by one member of the family working full-time was enough to pay a mortgage on a middle-class house for 2 adults and kids. Now, 2 adults working full-time is still not enough to pay the mortgage on a middle-class house. 2 adults working 3 jobs is not even always enough to pay the mortgage on a middle-class house. As I just showed you, middle-class houses, where I used to go to birthday parties when I was 8, back in the 1970s, listed for $2.88 million. $2.9 million for a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house in a neighborhood near where I grew up, right up the hill. You cannot make a mortgage of that working 2 or even 3 ordinary middle-class jobs. So there's a serious problem in the economy, and it's related to everything that I just told you, and everything I told you actually points to the solution, but you've got to be brave enough to do it. Ask yourself, which of the 2 parties in any country I'll talk about the United States because I know that country. But here in Australia, we've got Labor and Liberal. In the United States, we've got Republican, Democrat. Ask yourself, when have you ever heard politicians from either party saying, the real problem is Wall Street. The real problem is too much power for the financial sector. The real problem is usury. When have you heard a preacher talk about the real problem is usury? Apparently, the prophets of the Bible were most concerned with usury, charging interest. When's the last time you heard a sermon on that? When's the last time you heard a politician point to that as the problem that needs to be fixed? It can be addressed. It can actually be solved with an understanding of MMT. There's so much propaganda against MMT that most of my listeners will probably be appalled at some of the things that I've said, because you've been told, oh, the actual solution is a gold standard, or the actual solution is get rid of the deficit. Those are arguments by the banks. They don't want a deficit, because a deficit means more money for the people, less need to go into debt. I'll close with this slide. This is where we are today on this road stretching back into the distant time. Somewhere back there in the ancient time, the ancient world, back then, even they received their wisdom from something even before the most ancient civilizations we know of, going all the way back to this golden age that they talk about. There was a catastrophe that separated the ancient world from what I call the deep ancient, where the myths came from. The myths obviously came from something even more ancient than the most ancient civilizations we know of, because they're all using myths that are based on the same system, teaching the same things. Those myths talk about usury and the devouring of others as a central problem to be avoided. Scriptural supremacists took over and stamped out the ancient wisdom, and those scriptural supremacists took the very same scriptures that talk about usury as a problem, and they covered that all up and said, oh no, this is all about spiritual matters, not economic matters. Professor Hudson shows it in that book. These scriptures, from the start of the Old Testament all the way to the end of the New Testament, have so much to do with economics, but the literalists, like Augustine, spiritualized them and turned, forgive them their debts, forgive us our debts, turned into, just forgive me for my sins, having nothing to do with the economic word debt at all. Debt is at the heart of this. And the parasites took over at some point. Professor Hudson points to the fact that it was actually in Greece. It wasn't Babylon. Babylon was forgiving. They were having jubilees. They were forgiving the debts, just like the ancient wisdom said to do. It was in ancient Greece, which the West looks to as, the start of the West. It was in classical Greece that the oligarchs started getting an upper hand. And then when Alexander spread Greek ideas, this Hellenistic world, what you had was a hijacking of the ancient wisdom and an inverting of it, and the oligarchy started to get control. The parasites started to get control, and that led to the Dark Ages, feudalism, an obscuring. The scriptural supremacists want to spin a bunch of lies and false history about our ancient past so that we forget all about it. And they're still operating to this day. And they're trying to make you believe lies about money so that you don't understand these principles that I've laid out. That's what's devouring the West. It's private banking and usury, as opposed to the understanding of abundance that is taught in the myths, that the resources are given abundantly by the gods, and that kings or sovereign states, whether they're democratic or monarchical, have a duty of preventing the oligarchs from devouring the people. And they use very hard-hitting language when they're talking about it, comparing it to sodomizing people and devouring them. Thanks so much for listening.